Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Simon Podcast. I hope you are having a wonderful day today. And joining me today is my co-host, Micah Curran. Micah, how are you doing?
It's cold outside.
Baby, it's cold
I didn't
outside.
expect you to sing that song, but my wife looked at me this morning. She's like, "I didn't know it was supposed to be in the teens today," and I was like, "Yeah, it's 18 degrees outside."
It's getting colder. And I mean, especially, did you guys travel a lot during Thanksgiving, or did you guys pretty
No,
much stay in Southwest Ohio?
we stayed home because my in-laws went to my brother-in-law and sister-in-law's house. They live in southern Georgia, so we had Thanksgiving with them a few weeks prior,
Hmm.
and then uh, we weren't feeling really well last week, so we kind of just stayed home. We kind of
Hmm.
stayed near and dear to the homestead because none of us
Yeah.
felt great. And so
Yeah. Good, good. I traveled a bit, but like it was like from like Cleveland to like Ravenna. So it was only a 45-minute trek, but where my parents' house is, where my sister is hosting Thanksgiving, it's right in the snow belt. So it's weird
mm,
because I was up in Cleveland and it's like rainy, it's gloomy, it's cold. And then you start driving down to Ravenna and you start seeing the snow. And then even driving back home, Friday, there's a couple spots we would hit where you could just see like snow flurries and there'd be whiteouts and then it'd be fine. And then you hit another section and it was like that all the way down. So, but for the most part, nothing stuck. There's no snow on the ground. So everything's pretty good. Um, but overall, I think
well,
Thanksgiving
I
was
don't
great.
I don't know how much football you actually watch, Scott, but the did you see the Buffalo San Francisco game last night?
No, I barely
So
watch football.
so Buffalo obviously is like the snow capital of the United States, but
Mhm.
they were hosting San Francisco last night and they were calling for up to 2 feet of snow in Buffalo. And
Yeah.
so like in during the day, they were like, yeah, it's gonna be, you know, blistering cold and we've already got this much snow on the ground and we're expecting up to 36 inches of snow tonight before the game starts. So like last night they were playing in the snow and it was crazy because like they were talking about how Buffalo fans are just different because they just show up, they dig their seat out, they I mean there was nowhere to sit because there was so much snow. But
Yeah.
it's kind of ironic, not ironic, but weird that, for the last couple of years, we've had kind of a cooler, milder winter. Like it's not been like freezing cold, but like we've had mild temperatures in the 40s and we've had a lot of rain, but we haven't had much in the way of snow. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's maybe this is the year that we actually have a cold, long winter with significant snowfall and all those fun
Yeah.
things.
And the thing is like I love watching snow football games. And I think a lot of times it's because I remember as a kid, like anytime when I would play football, or at least some of my core memories that I still remember would be going outside, running in the snow, playing football in the snow, playing tackle football in the snow, um, and how fun that was. And it's a shame that so many of these stadiums now are getting domes, and it's like, well, you kind of miss the thrill because I think when you're playing in, and I guess it's kind of more of a fairness thing because if it's warm and there's no wind and no
If
elements,
you're out
then
playing in the West Coast and everything's really nice,
yeah. And for me, I feel like part of the advantage is, if you're the home team and you're playing where you could get snow like Buffalo or even Cleveland. Cleveland had a snow game against Pittsburgh
the
a
orders,
couple
yeah.
weeks ago. And I feel like in those moments, like that kind of gives you an advantage. Like not so much for Pittsburgh and Cleveland because they're both get snow, so it's not. But having San Francisco versus Buffalo and San Francisco who has no snow to Buffalo who's used to playing through not just snow but a large amount of snow and just seeing the fans there and they're all bundled up and they're yelling and they're screaming and you're just seeing fog from their breath going up. I mean, it's a whole unique experience that I feel like the modern day of football is kind of doing away with, especially since Cleveland has plans to build a new stadium with the dome, and that will kind of be the end of snow games for them.
Uh,
So,
it, it's ironic that you said that. I called my brother last night and I was like, you would think with Buffalo being like kind of the snow capital of the US, especially in regards to football, that they would have built a stadium with a dome a long, long time ago because of all the snow they get. Um, I remember years ago watching there was a game between Buffalo Bills, no, I'm sorry, the New York Giants and the Green Bay Packers in Green Bay, and Lambeau Field is, notorious for being cold, and
mhm.
um, I just remember watching that game, and I think it was -15, which is the actual temperature. And the coach from the New York Giants, who was an older man, I forget his name at this point, but like his face was like frostbit, and
Was
like
it Tom
it was,
Coughlin?
I think so.
Okay.
But it was wild. Like, but you could, like you said, like you could just see their breath, and like it was cold, like it was bitter cold, and these guys are just out there just, I don't care. And some people that they don't wear sleeves or like long sleeves or things like that, and it's like, dude. My brother played college football, and he said that's probably the worst feeling in the world when you go to play in a cold game like that and you don't have your arms covered up and it's cold and somebody's face masks hit you in the arm. It's
Ooh.
like he said it's probably one of the worst feelings in the world. He's like you can get tackled, knocked down, and all those fun things, but when it comes down to bare skin and being that cold, it's like no, no thing. I don't like cold weather, so.
Yeah.
I think we should talk about our topic today because it's
All
making me
right.
cold.
So, well, I have to talk. We have to talk about stories gone wild,
Oh
Mike,
yeah,
because oh my gosh.
you have a whole new definition to this.
Oh, so let me, and this may be the only story. It might be one of those ones where you're like, "Oh, Scott, you win. I can't top that." So, for those of you who don't know, a lot of times the Sunday before Advent, the church will participate in what's called hanging of the greens, which is where the church will go and they'll decorate the building outside, indoors for Christmas. So, a lot of Christmas trees, lights, pull out their mangers, the works. So my responsibility as a family minister is for the younger kids, the elementary age students. I'll go and take I'll go ahead and I will start putting together crafts. So we were making crafts. So I'm upstairs with the kids doing crafts, and a couple of my a teen youth came upstairs and said, "Hey, what can we do?" And I said, I don't know. I'm with the kids. Debbie would probably have a better idea because she's kind of coordinating everything. So I went upstairs and talked to Debbie. Debbie tells them to go outside and put Christmas lights and stuff outside on the trees, bushes, and around the church sign. Okay, so they're out there doing that, and her husband's out there, and they had a couple adults that would change out. And I know a couple times when I was done with the kids, I went out there and I could see there's an adult and some of them working. I'm like, all right. So eventually I'm just going around, just checking in with people. So then I go outside. And right now it's only just my teens out there, and they're just waiting for one of the adults to get some more lights. So I'm just saying, like, hey, how's everything going? Blah, blah, blah. And they say, you're not going to believe this. I go, okay, what just happened? And I'm thinking, okay, a light bulb exploded while they were turning it on, or they saw something random happen on, since we were kind of on a main street, something random happened on Main Street. So they're going and they're waiting for some more lights to come out. And since all the leaves have fallen, they notice that there's some Easter eggs from our Easter egg hunt that's still kind of in the bushes. So they're just cleaning them up, kind of getting them, throwing them away, whatnot. And two of my students notice that underneath the leaves, they see something that looks like a gun. So one of my students goes, I think that looks like a gun. My other student reaches down and grabs it, thinking it's a toy gun. And when he lifts it up, he could feel the heaviness of the gun, and it's a real gun. So, and he's like a Navy cadet. He does Navy cadet, so he's always doing like training and stuff. So he goes and he just checks. So he pulls open the gun to see, and already there's a full clip and there's a bullet in the chamber. It's a loaded gun. So now they're freaking out. So one of the teens goes and talks to one of the parents. They come out, they look at everything, and she's a veteran. She looks at it, so she just says, "Okay, you need to call the police. You need to give them a gun, and you need to tell the student who picked it up and touched it. You need to let them know that you touched and picked up this gun. So when they're dusting for fingerprints, they know that not to start knocking at your door in the middle of the night, especially if the gun is tied to like a crime." So when they tell me this story, I'm like, what in the world? It's like living, being a pastor up in like Cortland, a little small town up north of Youngstown, being a pastor in a little small town of Virginia, now being a pastor near a big, it's still a small little community, but we're right next to a gigantic city of Columbus and we're on a big main intersection. And just the stuff that you experience and see and witness is just bananas sometimes. It's like, who would have thought? And thankfully, I'm glad that my teens found it because a lot of times, like preschool, they'll have like their art party out there. So a lot of kids will play in the area. Or how long? I don't know how long that's been out there. If we did another Easter egg hunt and that gun was out there and a kid picked it up, yikes! That'd be some bad publicity for the church. But yeah, it's just wild. I can't make this stuff up, man. It's just too wild for me.
I'm not going to try to top it. But how long have you been at that church? 2 years? Almost three?
I'm in the middle of my third year right now.
Third? Okay. In the time that you've been there, we've had a gun incident. The fire department's been called. There's smoke. Um, the live streaming just randomly stops. Um, wasn't there
Someone
like a
poops.
homeless
So
situation?
yeah, someone pooped it. So, there's a homeless person. There was a homeless person like kind of living in this like little like connecting alcove thing that was kind of connected outside of the church. Like there's a bunch of stuff in there. And not only that, we also had someone who like went and stopped and defecated in the churchyard.
All that in your first 3 years in the
I
UMC.
know, man. Yeah. People go, "Why do you do the stories gone wild segment?" Well, because every week there's always something happening.
The church gives you more and more and more.
It's like if I could write a book, if I had to write a book about like my years, and each chapter was a year in ministry. Some of these chapters here in Bexley would be super long. So much stuff has happened, and then a lot of it's good stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of it has been really great and positive stuff. But then you have this weird stuff that happens, and it's stuff like that where you just like bust up laughing. It's so funny. Oh my goodness. So, I don't know how. Well, I guess I could segue that story to our topic. But our topic today is we're going to kind of talk about why men don't go to church. It's not, and here's the thing: I don't think it's a phenomenon. I remember years ago when I was in college, my dad got the book by David Murrow called "Why Men Hate Going to Church." And it was this outline of like kind of why men hate going to church, and they listed a bunch of different reasons. And then I recently, Michael, you shared a video with me from Mark Driscoll, which I have my opinions about Mark Driscoll, but
Oh, we
even
both
Mark,
do.
yeah, we both do. But he was bringing up an interesting point about kind of why men don't go to church, and he's kind of bringing a little bit of kind of some historical things. You started to see a decline, at least from what he said, kind of see a decline in men attending church after World War II. And it seemed like any time when there's been any amount of war, we keep seeing this be less and less. Um, and I know he kind of says that because there has been, at least from Mark Driscoll's words from the video, that because you had these men who gone off the war and all these women were at home, and they kind of made the church and they kind of created an environment that kind of created more of a feminine environment for church, which is why men don't feel comfortable there. Um, which I understand that happening World War II. I can understand that happening Vietnam. Um, But I almost feel like because we're in 2024 and things have changed so much as far as gender relationship, gender roles, um, it's almost like I don't really buy that case that the church has become too feminine. Um, Especially when you think about some of your more modern churches, there's like in warehouses. Like I don't know, like like you can't feminize a warehouse. I guess you could try to, but there's not really much of that there. So I don't really kind of buy that, but there are some. I think there are some reasons of why we see a less men in church. Um, And I don't know, like Micah, when you the church that you're attending, like how would you figure out the ratio between men and women that attend church? And I mean, I'm thinking more about adults. I'm not really talking about like teens or kids because that's kind of a mix, that's kind of difficult to gauge. But as far as like the adults you see, like how often would you say most of them, would you say it's like 50-50, 74, 70-30, I'm sorry.
I mean, well, two things. One, to answer your question, I think that it's about, I would say 50-50 or 60-40. It's a very family oriented church. Yes, there are some older people with the older generation, et cetera, but like I think that they're still married and their spouse still attends church with them. Um, there's a lot of young families where both the mom and the dad both attend. So I would say 50-50 or 60-40. But then also the video that you referenced with Mark Driscoll, I think that kind of the point he was, one of the points he was trying to point towards with this whole conversation of why men don't want to go to church is that, you know, there's there's an emotional attachment to going to church. And, you know, what's you know, some of the first things that you look for when you look at a new church. You want to look at kids ministry, you want to look at worship, you want to look at like their online presence, you want to look at their social media, all those things. And if they're appealing to women and children, then they're gonna come. And I think that's kind of the point that he was trying to make in respect to this whole conversation. But I think that I would agree with him in the sense of, you know, if churches do a great job with student ministry, children's ministry, and worship, I think that, you're going to see a more, I guess, pool of women and children coming than men. I don't know that I wholeheartedly agree with that conversation because a lot of the churches I've attended, there's been, you know, representation from men and women, families, etc. And it's hard to have that conversation when currently, like, you know, we're not in a world war and we're not in, we don't have, I mean, yes, we have soldiers and people that are in the military that are actively deployed, but, the reality of that situation is that I don't know how many, we'd have to do like a survey or something, but like, what's the demographic or percentage of folks that serve in the military that are deployed that go to church and their family goes to church while their significant other is out serving. Um,
Mm,
I do think it's kind of interesting because he brought up some other things where he talked about like, you know, as a worship leader, kind of like made sense to me, but like at the same time, I don't know because I think, as males, we can have the same sensitivity and feeling towards the Holy Spirit that a woman can. I don't think that there's any difference there.
mm,
Um, and I think that's kind of what he was getting at too. Like if you're in, you know, you're at a pivotal part in the service where worship is going really well, the Holy Spirit moves, and you just feel like you're, I don't know, convicted of sin, or you're just feeling that you need prayer for, a loved one that is going through something. Maybe you're financially strapped for cash. Maybe you lost your job. The pastor, gets up and instead of preaching a sermon, kind of pivots and goes into a time of prayer instead. and really kind of stops the service in its tracks because the Holy Spirit's moving. I don't see a difference, and I see that, and I've been in situations where both men and women, there's not a sensitivity issue to the Holy Spirit, and I wonder if that's kind of the point he was trying to make, that men are, you know, what's the word I'm looking for, Scott? Like men are tough and we don't have to have feelings. I'm like, that's not true, right? Like, I mean, if you have sensitivity, right? I guess sensitivity is a word for it. But like, if you feel God moving, then it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your sin. So, just an interesting conversation overall, I think.
Yeah, and one of the things I find interesting too, especially I remember in regards to worship music, and not I wouldn't necessarily say worship music, I would say Christian radio. I once heard a statistic that Christian radio stations will tailor their music selection to usually like single mothers. Middle-aged women and single moms would be kind of your target audience within that 18 to 40, was it 18 to 49 demographic? So when you're thinking about the songs you listen to on the radio and how you're singing in the car, and you got that messages of hope and love, and then those are the same songs you're singing in church, well then you now have a lot more songs that are kind of more about feelings than necessarily theology, I guess, in some ways. Um, which doesn't totally make sense, but makes sense in a way where I can see how somebody might, or at least a man might kind of be like, well, I don't want to listen to this, you know, this music where it's all about blessing me, love me, all this stuff. And I think a lot of that might be kind of some inward psychological reasons on why that may be. Um, so to kind of give a little bit more kind of structure on this topic, I found this site. It's actually from a church here in Columbus, but this was published in February of 2022. So this is like, a couple years old, but they kind of list some of the following reasons why men don't come to church. And one of the things I always hate when people put articles is they'll throw some statistics out there, but they never cite their sources. It drives me nuts. Like like right here, they said that when a father, that's the thing. It says in many cases, men are dragged to church every Sunday by either their girlfriends or wives. This is a serious issue because statistics have shown that when a father attends church regularly, there is an 85% chance that his spouse and children will attend church as well. Contrite. That's a misspelling. However, when only the wife attends church, only 15% of the time will her family follow. My observations of my own local church also bear this out. Okay, I hear that statistic. Where's it coming from? Because no one's been able to attach it to any research or data. So again, that's statistics. Take with a grain of salt since they didn't cite their source, but that must be the doctrine in me. Anyway, so here's some of the reasons why. Number one, many churches do not clearly articulate their vision. Men are generally task oriented and are motivated by vision and purpose. Thoughts?
Read that again, but slower. That
I'm
that quote.
sorry, the caffeine's kicking in. Many churches do not clearly articulate their vision. Men are generally task oriented and are motivated by vision and purpose.
I mean, I can see how that um, makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
guys want to go straight to the point, and I don't know. I think that it's hard for me to sit back and decipher that, because it's like I've been doing this for so long, and it's like
Yeah.
I can't put myself in the shoes of an average you know Joe that's coming into your church and is like, well, I guess. I'm not going to go to church because I don't know what the heck's going
Yeah.
on. But it is important to know what your mission is.
Hmm.
And if the church isn't clear on that or doesn't really have a said mission statement, um, that's a whole other conversation. But I think
Yeah.
that for the context of this conversation, I think that, we have to, I think the church has to be ready for anything, right? Any kind of situation coming in and out of the door, whether it's you're trying to win everybody, so to speak, right, for Jesus.
Hmm.
And the idea that, you got a stubborn, uh, I guess, egotistical male that comes into your church and is not going to want to come to church or going to come back because he doesn't know what's going on, then that's on the church, not on the man. But I think there's also an argument that could be made for the flip side where it could be on the man instead of the church because he's just being stubborn for stubborn's sake.
Yeah. Um, I would say I would agree with number one because even like with us having a whole like new having consultants come in this year, having a whole marketing team, kind of the whole rebranding of the church, the idea of kind of figuring out who we are, what we want to do, who we want to be, that is kind of giving us a clear vision of what we need to do instead of just kind of, and I think a lot of it happens like, if you're kind of coming in into a church and you had a previous minister who may not had a strong vision, or they just kind of kept the same vision and mission statement that's been at the church for 20, 30 years, that's something that kind of has to do instead of just kind of going through the motions within church life. And I would say this, I know there's a gentleman in our church who he come occasionally with his girlfriend. They're now married now, but he'd come occasionally, but there was one time where after Sunday morning service, a couple of us left and we drove to this urban farm in Columbus, and we got to work on this urban farm after church. And it was interesting because this guy said, I didn't know that a church could do this,
Mm.
that we could like leave, like end service early, leave and go do ministry by helping, pull vegetables, weed gardens, build walkways, like whatever type, and learn more about kind of here's how this is impacting this section of the city of Columbus. And I think that kind of made a little bit of what was on our, even though we're changing kind of our mission statement, vision statement, but what we had currently, this kind of put into practice what we as a church believe and what we are striving to do. And I think it's since then, like I've seen him almost every single Sunday, except for when he went on his honeymoon when he got married. But I mean, it was like almost like that epiphany or that switch that turned on that said, oh, okay. So yeah, I think a lot of times if you have a clear vision and purpose and the men in your church feel like they can understand that and get it, then they'll be lifelong committed members of your church if they get it. Um, the second one was Sunday messages are often more hype than practical teaching with substance. Men are often very cognitive and logical and crave practical teaching that will equip them to be better husbands, and businessmen. I disagree with that one. Like, because and here's why, because I do agree that a lot of times men are very cognitive and logical. They're stereotypically they're kind of the problem solvers, right? They're the ones who are usually grounded, and anytime there's a problem, they're the ones who are trying to fix it or solve it. Or if they can't fix it and solve it, they know who to call to get it taken care of, and they kind of, they won't get taken advantage of or whatnot by a dealership or a mechanic or whatever the case may be. However, when I think of churches like Elevation or Hillsong, and occasionally I watch those I kind of watch those like messages or even some of the clips, and they show it and they kind of show like the congregation, like a wide shot of the congregation. There's definitely a lot of men, and that's the thing. Like as much as people give crap about these mega churches just preaching more about hype and not giving any substance or practical teaching in their messages, if that's the case, then why is it that so many men seem to gravitate to those type of churches where maybe your small church that is very big on practical theology and living out theology and it's not about the hype, very often men don't attend those type of churches. So I I understand kind of the heart behind number two, but I think that's an error because obviously I don't think that's 100% true.
Yeah. I mean, I would just agree and mirror everything you said because, I too watch Elevation Church on occasion and same with Bethel and, Hillsong, etc. And the demographic is very, you see a lot of males in the crowd or on the stage. And if you're of an SBC background and it's a very male driven uh, church, all of your elders are men, your pastors are men, women can't hold the title of pastor, all those things that we've talked about over the years. But like, if you go to a bigger church, it's got an SBC background or a Southern Baptist background for those who are not understanding what I'm saying. They're very much in respect to the men of the head of the household and women submit to your husbands and you know, and they very much lead the church that same way. It's like, they have, like I said before, elders who are male, pastors who are male, people on, you know, eh, people that are on staff don't necessarily have the title of pastor, like they may have the title of director. Um, Not every church does that, but it's a common model within the Baptist community. And so I see a lot of folks that are, attending Reformed churches or um, SBC churches, and it's very much like that. You see a lot of male leadership
Mm,
um, in every respect of the church, whether it's an usher, whether it's a speaker, whether it's a worship leader, whether it's a sound tech, um, etc. So um,
yeah. And
it,
that kind of hits on a lot of the other points in this article about, a lack of male leadership, like having a lack of male leadership, whether among pastors, elders, deacon, and ministry teams. If mostly it's run by women, then you kind of feel like you can't be part of a team or can't connect because it's not being run by men.
yeah, I mean, uh,
Um,
I had a conversation with a pastor last year about the kind of the same conversation about women leadership in SBC churches, and he said, even though we believe that, we very much celebrate and have. He's like, our church could not run if it weren't for the women in it. Like he just, he was very accepting of the fact that hey, our church would not be what it is without the women who lead it,
yeah.
and they may not have titles or they may not be I don't know, pastors or elders, but they certainly run the church in respect to leadership. So
Hmm.
anyway, it's
Yeah. And I think, yeah, I agree with that. And that's even the same thing too. Like in number six, it says most strong men have a hard time submitting to a female executive leader or a female pastor in a church setting. I am told there are some rare exceptions to this, although I've never witnessed one firsthand. And then again, like the church that's this article that's putting it out, it's like Living Word Bible Fellowship in Columbus, which my hunch is probably a SBC background or at least a Baptist background. So I get it, but I have a we have a female pastor at our church, and she leads very well, and a lot of the male leaders in the church are pretty much behind it. Like they don't feel uncomfortable. They're like, hey, if we're moving in the right direction and we're seeing traction, then it doesn't matter if you're a male or a female. At least something's moving, something's happening, which is good. Number three, I'll read number three and four because they're short. Number three says Sunday worship often involves excessive display of emotion that makes men feel uncomfortable. And Sunday worship is often 45 minutes or longer, which is way too long for the average first time male visitor. Thoughts?
Uh,
Is worship too emotional for men?
I kind of hit on that earlier with like the whole
Mm-hmm.
sensitivity to the Holy Spirit, but in respect to the last point you made, I think that if a person, male, female, etc., in the context of this conversation, males, isn't churched, they're not going to know what's going on if worship goes on for 45 minutes. They're like, why is this? Like if they have like the idea of what church is, knowing that hey, I may hear some music, I may hear some teaching, but I don't know how to react or don't know what to expect in reference to length of time. If you go into a very Pentecostal situation and worship's 45 minutes to an hour, people are going to look around, you know, especially in church, like in the context of this illustration, I think that sure, they're going to be questioning what's going on and may not come back because they don't know. And that's an interesting conversation of itself, Scott. Like people don't if you've never been to church in your life and you don't know what to expect, then how do you teach people that? Right? Like I mean, I know that you teach people the gospel, I know that you teach people, um kind of the principles of church, but like how do you other than just attending, how do you illustrate that for people? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and here's the thing, and I'm curious if a lot of this, I think a lot of this, because I'm reading through all these other things too, and I'm curious if a lot of this has to do with generational trauma. I mean, in all seriousness, like I mean, my dad was never someone who showed a lot of emotion. And I'm sure his dad didn't show a lot of emotion just because of the time men are supposed to be tough, men don't cry, men don't show feelings, etc. Right? Oh yeah, except
Yeah.
anger. Like anger, that's pretty much the only feeling that men will show is anger. Then you get to like me, who I kind of have some feelings. I do show sadness, I do show when I'm happy, I do show things. But I was in the same way, you got to toughen up, be a man, all this stuff. And even though I've kind of cut a lot of that away, it's still very much like it's hard for me to articulate my feelings when I feel hurt, when I feel sad, when I feel like I've been insulted or offended, until it gets to the point where I'm boiling over and I'm just angry. And then that kind of becomes the predominant emotion is anger. And I don't really know what's driving the anger, because anger is usually a secondary emotion. But then I think about my son, and the one thing I'm always do is if my son's hurt, he could always come to me. He could always tell me if he's upset. He cries. I mean, he's 10 years old, and the dude still cries. He still shows emotion. He still talks about if he's fearful or sad. He doesn't like stuff it down. So I'm almost curious when we get to my grandkids or my great grandkids, if a lot of this stuff that we're seeing now about why men don't go to church are even going to have a key factor into why men don't go to church, especially when it comes to emotions and feelings. Because there's very few songs about God that men, that as a Christian, I need to take up my sword and my shield and I need to fight the enemy. It's a lot of it's just about healing. And, I think there's a lot of men who need to experience a lot of healing through a lot of generational trauma, or just trauma that they put on themselves because you're trying to be tough and trying to be the strong one. And yet you're getting, with work, with society, you're getting shot at, figuratively, you're getting shot at and you have these wounds and you're not healing them because you're trying to be tough. So you're not really sharing, hey, this situation happened at work and it really bothered me. You just kind of shrug it off and keep going, even though it kind of hit a nerve, and yet you just keep going. And you just keep going to the point where you're just a shell. You're just like an empty shell of a person. And you have no feelings. You're just constantly always moving forward to try to provide for your family, and yet you don't really show a lot of emotion. So obviously, when you go to church and there's this thing about Jesus can heal you, and you can lay your burdens to the side and take on the burden of Christ because it's easy and it's light. Like, I think a lot of that is, I don't want to hear that stuff because that's not realistic in my point of in my world, because I have to keep going. I have to carry it. If I drop the burden, then my family doesn't eat. I can't provide for my family. And it's like, there's so much stuff, and it's one of the things where it has to be a case by case basis on what's really going on in the minds of men.
Almost to add to that. I mean, like it's just like I think that you're right. Like it's just it'll be interesting to see in 20, 30, 40 years if the same conversation's happening, how if it happening, how much it is reversed, if that makes sense. Like we're
Yeah.
going to be talking about, you know, the idea of men being too emotional or overly
Yeah.
sensitive, I guess. So I, I don't have much to add other than I think that it's interesting that I'm a very emotional person, and
Hmm.
I get caught up in the spirit, especially when I lead worship. I cry a lot.
Hmm.
Um, Over this last year and a half or so since I've been diagnosed with all the anxiety stuff, like it's you know there was a point before I had started medication and therapy that like I remember Alicia and I went to a store and I was just sitting in the car and I just started crying, like just sobbing
Hmm.
uncontrollably. And she's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And I'm like, "I want to know what's wrong with me." And I just at that point had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of trauma, a lot of hurt, a lot of um, you know, unresolved issues to my own life. And
Yeah.
but like you said, how often do we not deal with those things? Or people, it's more about the pride of oh, I don't want to show emotion versus it's okay to show emotion and it's okay to work through some of those things.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I just want to, there's a couple more things I want to hit because I feel like it's kind of some of the more reasons, because a lot of these things are like the feminization of Christianity, see Jesus as wimpy and effeminate. That's emotionalism. Churches are feeling centered. Okay. Most churches celebrate Mother's Day and ignores Father's Day. I've never experienced that.
I haven't either.
Many words in contemporary songs emphasize the church as the bride of Christ. Like, again, a lot of emotionalism, feelings based. But there's a couple that I think are very cool, and I think they're tied together. Lack of male bonding, fellowship, and male discipleship. Men in marketplace leadership are not affirmed. Many businessmen feel their leadership gifting is not recognized in the local church. They are only viewed as cash cows to fund the local church. And then many men, businessmen in particular, will attach themselves to a successful enterprise exhibiting a spirit of excellence and fiscal responsibility. This is a far cry from many shabby storefront church operations in which the pastor runs a mom and pop shop with autocratic control without fiscal disclosure, accountability, and proper church government.
Yeah.
And yeah, lack of male bonding, fellowship, and male discipleship, absolutely. There's so many. I mean, even within the Church of God, we have a national Christians Women Connection, or Women of the Church of God, that has been in place for years, and yet we have no national recognition of men's ministry. I mean, the state of Ohio has a men's ministry. They always have their annual Oxford, so I believe they're still doing it somewhere. Not at Marengo anymore, but they're probably doing it somewhere. But the fact is they're, well, seriously.
No, I know,
But
I know. I'm just thinking, I'm like, I, I'm not discounting that, Scott. Please, please don't take it that way. I was thinking when you said the Oxfords, I remember going to the Oxfords as a kid, but then when you were like that and the Marengo is closed, I was thinking, I wonder if they're just sitting in a field in the middle of nowhere.
I don't know. They
So
could be.
I'm surprised.
I think often they try to be more central located. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're doing it like in at Warsaw or if they're doing it in Springfield campground, like one of the
I
camp,
just
or
think it,
maybe or
I could
or
just
they
imagine a
rotate
bunch of
them.
these old Church of God guys just sitting in the middle of a cornfield roasting an ox with
Roasting an ox
no.
for hours. Um, I mean, even if we go back to like when Promise Keepers was very prevalent in like the mid '90s to early 2000s, like I mean, there was men's ministry in my church, and then we'd go to Promise Keepers. So there was a lot of stuff that kind of really hit that niche of male leadership and men being not necessarily men being men, but men bonding together and having a deep relationship with Christ. And even like with Promise Keepers, those were men who would go and they would cry, they would hug each other, they'd show a lot of emotion, right? But they probably felt more comfortable because they're around a bunch of dudes and they're not a bunch of like women or their wives or their children watching the dad cry. Um, so I think in some case, you know, the lack of male bonding, fellowship, and discipleship is key. I think the other thing too is I think men who are leaders are not recognized or they're not able to use their gifts. Like we have a couple men in our church. One of them basically works with stocks, and he's actually going to be teaching a Bible study on kind of managing money the Christian way and understanding tithing and I mean it's like he's using his gifts, his talents. The marketing team we're going through, the guy who's kind of head of the marketing corporation is a member of our church, so he's kind of leading it up. So here we're using his gifts and talents to kind of help the church, and I think that's kind of very big as far as like, hey, if you have these men who have these gifted talents, let them use them. Let them use them. Like if you have a guy who can play drums, let him play drums on a Sunday. Like if he's good, if he's not good, don't let him play drums. But I mean, my son, even now, my son always wants to kind of help out in the nursery. He's just very gravitated towards like caring and loving like kids who are younger than him. And probably because he's a big brother, so he has that natural caring heart. So he always wants to like work in a nursery. I'm like, buddy, you can't until you're of youth age. It's like next year when you're of youth age, then we can sign you up and we can put you on this nursery schedule for you to work in the nursery. He's like, oh, okay. Like, but I have to tell, but it's almost like, you know, but then even this about, men want to attach themselves to something that's successful. I mean, that's probably why you see a lot of men at like Hillsong or Evolution or Bethel or some of these mega churches is because when you see a large group of people, that's always going to communicate success. And especially if you're thinking, okay, they have, and I'm even sometimes, even like some of those big churches, they may not be transparent or accountable with their finances or anything like that. But it's that illusion that this is a successful church because you have three services and 1,000 people each service. Versus you walk into a small church of 50, and even though you may have an accountant, you may have people who have keep the books and they're very transparent about everything that's going on, yet it's a church that, on a good day may have 50, on a bad day have 13. And it fluctuates. You're probably thinking, well, this isn't a successful church. I'm not going to attach myself to this church.
It's all valid. I mean, it's fascinating. And when you sit back and think about it, right? I mean, you just sit back and try to analyze some of these thoughts that people have, fixated on. And I would agree with you, Scott, that like I think that there's more of an opportunity to get people plugged in these days than there was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, Men want to serve in the nursery, men want to serve in youth ministry, men want to serve on the worship team, men want to, be an elder. Like, but in every church I've served in, I've had both, right? Like, I'm not seeing evidence that what Mark Driscoll is saying is happening in churches, or at least the ones that I've been a part of.
Yeah, and that's why when I think about men not attending church, or I mean, I hate to say this, but I think if you see a lot of men in church, it may be because they're empowering men, they have a good men's group, they all these things that we've kind of listed. But I'm also kind of curious if you are a man and let's say you have a certain viewpoint. Like, for example, if you are a man and you are out in the country and you go to a country church, but they have a hunting ministry and all the men in the community like hunting, well, guess what? You're going to that church because, hey, a lot of my hunting buddies go there and they have a hunting ministry and that's something we can use, right? So I think a lot of times with men, if there's something, a group or something that they can connect to, that can kind of like, I mean, it could be the same way. Like if there's a bunch of men who for some reason love to knit and knit hats and gloves for homeless children, which I know sounds bonkers, but if that's something that you as a man like, hey, I love to knit, and you go and you start joining this ministry at this church because there's a knitting club where you knit stuff for kids, then yeah, you're going to be a part of that. So I think a lot of times, like, or hey, you have a church that has a very successful fantasy football league. Or I mean, I saw a lot of men go to church when there was like a sports thing, like, oh, we have a church softball league, or we have a church soccer league, or a church dodgeball league. Like men would be a part of that because, like, hey, I love to play dodgeball. I'll be a part of this, or at least as a gateway to get, hey, come to our dodgeball thing, and then here's this. Um, but as far as the men and the emotions things, I don't buy it because especially when I think about the groups that use our church outside of normal Christian functions, like Gamblers Anonymous, um, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. Yeah, there's women there, but there's a lot of men there too, sharing about their struggles and sharing about their feelings. So the fact that they feel comfortable walking into a church, sitting in a church classroom or a church basement, talking about the struggles they have as an alcoholic or being a drug addict or gambling their life savings away, like they're open to sharing that. So I don't buy that they can't come to a church because it's too emotional, because they can get emotional talking about their habit and trying to be better versus, well, I don't want to sit there and hear about how God loves me. It's too emotional. Like that stuff doesn't compute. I think it's kind of a little off in some ways. I don't think we're really getting to the core issue on why men rarely come to church.
I totally agree with you.
All right. Any final thoughts from you, Micah?
Mm, no, but I think it's an interesting conversation for sure. I think that it's one that's needed to have because I think, and this isn't a knock on anybody, but like I think that we've over the last several years have focused a lot on women and a lot on diversity, but like what about men and where are they at? So um,
Yeah.
it's interesting to have the conversation and to see where people are.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I don't know, here's my last bit, and I don't know the answer. It's just more of thinking out loud. But when I think about marriages that end in divorce, a lot of times what I tend to see is, or at least what I've witnessed, is a lot of times when there's a divorce, I'll see a lot of women and their kids start coming to church. They'll start being, if they weren't an active member, if they weren't active in the church, then they're an active church now because of divorce. Because again, there's a support group type of situations. Maybe they have a divorce care group, but being in service, having their kids there, they feel like, okay, at least I'm giving my kids some type of good, strong values. Maybe there's some good male leadership, depending on the situation with whatever the husband. But on the husband side, I feel like when a divorce happens, very rarely do I see men gravitate to church in the midst of a divorce or like a split like that. I feel like they gravitate towards They put themselves into their work because that's what makes them fulfilled. I no longer have a family that fulfills me. I'm now going to pour myself into work, or I'm going to pour myself into hanging out with the boys, or I'm going to pour myself into, in the worst case, I'm going to pour myself into alcoholism, or doing drugs, or pornography, or whatever the case may be. So I'm almost curious, what will it take, or what does it have to take, whether it's a responsibility of the church, or it's more of the responsibility of, again, trying to redefine social norms, societal norms, and dealing with generational trauma, where when a split happens, divorced men feel like, I need to gravitate to the church for healing and to process everything after a messy divorce. So I don't know. That's just me thinking out loud. I don't know the answer to that, but it's just an observation that I have. But friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope this information has been helpful. If you're a pastor listening to this and you witness kind of this phenomenon of less and less men attending your church, feel free to message us. If you're somebody who's like, man, it's equal men and women at my church, I don't see any of this stuff that you guys are talking about in my church, we'd like to know that too. You can just go ahead and shoot us, mention us in the comment section and wherever you're listening to this podcast, or you can go ahead and go to our website, dscottstedman.com, send us an email, and we'll read your messages on the air on our next episode. So have a wonderful day, and God bless. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. The Scott Stedman podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for listening.